In this video, we're going to go over a larger example of mapping entities to relations. So I want you to try this on your own first. So go to the web server and create a file called event.rm, and then convert this entity relationship diagram to a relational model. Make sure you use the info icon if you're not sure how to create a relational model, as it will guide you through certain things that you should do. However, the creation is very similar to an entity relationship diagram with just a few differences, such as domain constraints and the primary key, foreign key pairs. So go ahead and try this on your own, pause this video, and then come back to compare your answers. All right, welcome back. So what I've done here is I've created the slide as an entity relationship diagram on my server. I'm going to go ahead and just copy all this from that page, and then we'll go back to our demo student directory. I'm going to then create a new file, and I'm going to call this event.rm. I'll go inside of this file, and I will paste the entity relationship diagram. You'll notice that it removed all of the arrows when I pasted it. However, it is now set up for me to easily convert this entity relationship diagram to a relational model. So let's start with the fields and the domain constraints. So for event, you can see this is a composite attribute that I need to break into its individual separate components. So I'm going to use this keyboard shortcut of Control-D to duplicate the field. So I'm going to duplicate it 3 times. This first one is going to be street. The second one is going to be city. And this third one is going to be state. And the fourth one is going to be zip code. I'm just going to hold down Shift to move city to right after street, just because I prefer it that way. And same with state after city and zip code after begin. Again, the order of these is irrelevant. This is just a matter of preference. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and add each one of the domain constraints. So for event ID, I'm going to use integer. For name, I'm going to do varchar. For description, it's longer than 255 possibly, so I'll use the text domain constraint. For street, we'll use varchar. For city, we'll use varchar. For state, we'll use char. For zip code, we'll use either integer or char. You decide. For begin, this could be date or date time. Let's just go ahead and use date time, same for end. Just as a reminder to cycle through these fields, I'm using tab and shift tab. All right, for charity, since we have only simple attributes here, we don't need to break apart the composite attributes, so I'm going to use integer for charity ID. For name, I'm going to use varchar. For description, I'm going to use varchar. For phone, I'm going to use what is called big int. Now, big int allows enough characters for a phone because integer is not big enough to hold a lot of phone numbers. For email, I'm going to use varchar. For contact, I'm going to use a varchar. So contact is the name of the contact. And then for contact phone, I'll use big int as well. For donor, we have the same issue with street, city, state, and zip code. So rather than duplicating work, I'm going to just hold down Control on the street and drag it over here, and it should copy that. I'll do the same thing for city, and the same thing for zip code, and the same thing for state. I'll go ahead and move type after zip code, and I'll move phone after zip code. So we'll go ahead and get rid of address. All right, so for donor ID, we have integer. For name, we have varchar. For phone, let's do big int again. For type, we have varchar. For donation, we have simple attributes again. So for donation ID, we'll do integer. For value, let's do double. For description, let's do text. For received, let's get rid of that optional flag. We'll use char, like 1 or 0, or we could use integer 1 or 0. For member, I'm going to do the same thing with street, city, state, and zip code. So I'll just hold down Control and drag street, and I'll drag city and state and zip code. And then we'll go ahead and delete the address field. And then we'll duplicate the name, drag it up, and this first one's going to be first name, and this second one is going to be last name. Then for member ID, we have integer. For first name, we have varchar. For last name, we have varchar. For email, let's have varchar. And type, we have varchar. Committee is a bunch of simple attributes, so we'll just do integer for committee ID. Name is going to be varchar. Description, text. Mission, let's do text as well. For work contribution, the total number of hours someone's contributed, it could be partial hours, so let's do double here. So now what we're going to do is focus on the entity integrity constraints. So each of the ones with underlying values have entity integrity constraints. Charity event, organized event, and work contribution, however, do not. So charity event should use event ID and charity ID together. So I'm going to just hold down Control and drag charity ID and event ID over. We'll just delete this extra field. And then I'm going to take event ID and click and drag it to event ID to create the foreign key primary key pair. Notice how it automatically italicized it. And same goes for the charity ID. Then for organized event, I'm going to drag event ID over and committee ID over, and together they are the primary key. I will then go ahead and delete that last field, drag from event ID to event ID, and from committee ID to committee ID to create my primary key foreign key pairs. For work contribution, that is the associative entity between event and member. So I'm going to hold down Control, drag event ID down here, and drag member ID up. And that together is my primary key. I'll drag event ID to event ID, and I'll drag member ID to member ID for my primary key foreign key pairs. Between committee and member, we have a one-to-many relationship, so I'm going to take the committee ID and I'm going to drag it over to the member. It automatically made it part of the primary key because it was a primary key on the other side. I'll just toggle this as a primary key. I like my foreign keys at the bottom. This is a matter of preference. It's not necessary for you to do that. Then what I'm going to do is drag from committee ID to committee ID, indicating the primary key foreign key pairs. For donation, what's involved is a donor, a member, and event. So I'm going to take the primary key of member, and I'll move member ID over. I'll move event ID over, and I'll move donor ID over. Now the three of these are not primary key fields, so I'll toggle primary key. And again, I like to move these down to the bottom. So I'll go ahead and do that. And then we'll drag from donor ID to donor ID, and then I'll put event ID up here. And then we'll drag from event ID to event ID, and then from member ID to member ID. All right, so now we have completed our relational model. We have identified all the domain constraints. We have identified all the entity integrity constraints, and we have identified all the foreign key, primary key, referential integrity constraints. And this is what the final model looks like.